Hi, everyone, and welcome to the newest digital talk in the Lost and Found Agency series. Today's talk features a conversation between Xiaoyu Weng and Zheng Bo. Before we begin, we would like to respectfully acknowledge the land on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has now been erased forever. We also acknowledge the island of Ukta-Umguk as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. And we acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and the ancestral homelands of the Innu of Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatukavut. We recognize all First Peoples who are here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. The first person I'd like to introduce is Xiaoyu Weng. Xiaoyu is the curator and a writer based in Toronto and in New York. She's currently the Carroll and Morton Rapp curator and head of modern and contemporary art at the AGO in Toronto. Weng's curatorial and writing practice focuses on the impacts of globalization, identity, and decolonization, as well as the intersection of art, science, and technology. Previously, Weng was an associate curator at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. In 2019 and 2018, she served as the curator of the 5th Ural Industrial Biennial of Contemporary Art in Yekaterinburg, Russia. She has also held curatorial positions at the Kadist Art Foundation, where she continues to serve as an advisor. Zheng Bo grew up in Beijing and now lives on Lantau Island, Hong Kong. Committed to more than human vibrancy, he investigates the past and imagines the futures from the perspectives of the marginalized communities and marginalized plants. He grows weedy gardens, living slogans, eco-queer films, and Wanwu workshops to cultivate ecological wisdom beyond the Anthropocene extinction. Solo exhibitions include Wanwu Council at the Gropius Bau, You Are the 0.1% Sharing Stiftung in Berlin, Life is Hard, Why Do We Make It So Easy at Kanduri Farm and Botanic Garden in Hong Kong, and he has participated in the Liverpool Biennial, the Yokohama Triennale, Manifesta, Taipei Biennale, and the Shanghai Biennale. He also has been invited to a Fogo Island Arts residency in 2023. But without further ado, I will pass it over to you both.
Thank you so much, Michaela, and thank you for the Fogo Foundation to invite me and Zheng Bo to be in this conversation. I have been a long-term admirer of your work, I guess. So this is a really nice special occasion to be in conversation with you to understand more of your thinking behind your practice. And I also just consider as an opportunity to kind of collaboratively explore some of the ideas that reflect in a lot of your work. I think I would like to start by asking you to talk maybe a couple of your specific work from my personal experience encountering them and seeing them. That's also how I actually first get to know your practice, is through this particular work we're looking at in the spring that is shown in Palermo in Italy as part of the Manifesta Biennial. And I think it's an ongoing series where you titled it as curatorial. You mentioned that this is a made-up word. So maybe we can just start by explaining a little bit about the title of the work and how that is connected to your thinking.
So the word curatorial, is based on the older term for ferns, and philia is about love and intimacy. So for me, this work is, this work is, like you said, it's ongoing work. I started in 2016. It's still not completed yet. So almost every year, I go to the same forest in Taiwan to film one chapter of the film. So the film is about sexual and perhaps also emotional intimacy between men and ferns. Because ferns are so vibrant in Taiwan and also very important to the indigenous cultures. And as someone who's not from Taiwan, I wanted to get to know Taiwan through this particular group of plants. So the image here is the installation in Palermo in the botanical garden, which is, absolutely beautiful itself. And I was, I was very happy that they showed this work in an outdoor setting with bamboos that have been there for, it's not these particular one, but the bamboo clusters have been there for over 100 years. So like one theme of my practice is interspecies intimacy. How do we really cultivate intimate relations with plants, and in my case, plants. But there are many other artists who are working on this theme too, how to cultivate intimate relations with non-humans.
Yeah, I think one thing that struck me looking at the work and recalling my experience was there is this desire to communicate with a species or plants in your case that's beyond a common language or ways of just normal language-based communication we have. So you had commented on the work of how we could rely on bodies or other alternative forms of communication to promote different forms of understanding or maybe compassion and sympathy with the species that we share the planet with. I wonder if you could comment that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think you already suggested, because we often think about communication through language, like what we're doing now, of course. But when I started to work with plants about 10 years ago, I kept thinking, how do we communicate with plants? And then I realized that in nature, some, like I can hear birds now in the background. So birds communicate with language like we do, or like we like birds. But most life forms actually communicate in many different ways, by scent, which is just chemical, which is based on chemical signals, but also by touch, and by vision. Of course, plants can see as well. They can detect light, and they can detect different wavelengths of light. So the film is really actually to push myself to experiment these different ways of interacting or relating to plants, not based on language. And I think because I often think that we know how to do this. I think maybe that's why I chose, I'm interested in sexual relation, in sexual plays, let's say sexual plays, because I think when we are engaging sexual plays with other humans, we also don't rely just on language, right? So we also smell, we also touch, we bite, we use many different parts of the body to interact. So I think we know how to do it. We just don't, we're not very open-minded when it comes to non-humans. So I think that's why I wanted to experiment with these things in the film.
Yeah, just as you had commented, I think the practice you're having here is also beyond just I guess, a visualization of or romanticization of a certain sort of sexual and erotic desire. I think here communication is also carries very important political implications, where some of the commentaries on your work also talked about how sexuality itself is a very important indication of political system and reflects our society. So I think there's a lot of these potential in informing a sort of a transformation or radical change that we might be able to get inspired of. I think that just lead me to think that how do you see that the relationship you're trying to put forward, the symbiotic relationship that we have with other species, connected to a much bigger awareness when you talk about our ecological future, and all these bigger topics and bigger discourses that are being referenced in your work?
Let me move on. I'll
Sure.
show. I'll talk a little bit about this this practice I started since the pandemic. I think I like many people, I'm very much, I'm very concerned with the climate crisis and ecological crisis, and I try to change my own life to live more ecologically. And I also start to think how, how as an artist, I not only work on these topics, to raise awareness or, even push the boundary in terms of our thinking, but also really change the way I live and practice as an artist. So since the pandemic, I also, like many people, I stopped, I traveled less. And so I finally had time to go up the hill beyond, behind the village where I live to actually not to draw, but actually just to walk around to see, to get to know the plants that live here. So I often call them my plant neighbors, because in the village, of course, I know my neighbors. It's a very small village, and I have wanted to spend more time to get to know the plant neighbors. But before the pandemic, I was doing more residencies, and so finally I have, a pretty stable routine here every day. So I will go up in the morning to take a walk and to see the plants and to smell them. And then I would sit to draw them, to draw some of them. And I think the film in Taiwan, to me, is something that I can experiment in a relatively short period of time, like a week or 2 weeks. We go to the forest, we experiment, and then we leave. But this new, this practice for about 2 years now, every day I go up the hill to draw, is kind of a slow relationship building, right? It's not based on passion, but it's really based on, I think for me, it's really based on patience. So it's very easy to do. I would sit for 20 minutes or an hour, but I'll be walking for like an hour or 2 hours. And I don't need to know all the plants in a very short time. I just get to know them slowly. And I also, in the beginning, I was interested in finding out their names, but now I feel they're just, like in the village, I don't know the names of my neighbors, but I do know them. So I'm also thinking about this notion of knowing, and how do we know something without resorting to language, resorting to communication even. So I think this is a different forms of relationship and intimacy. And it's also, I'm thinking, how do I really develop intimacy with, say, a habitat, the plants collectively in the area where I live, rather than with very individual plants like in the film. So these are the things that I've been thinking about. Yes. Yeah, so just to say, I think there are different forms of many different approaches. I think these two projects are just two approach, but I'm sure many different approaches.
Yeah, this is great because when you were showing the overview of the plants and of course these specific imageries also reminds me there is this overlap of methods, but also very distinguished approach. This reminds me of early biologists would go to the wild and document, new species of plants or flowers, and making drawings as a way to kind of create index and system of knowledge. But like you said, this is actually, they are trying to, create a system with the name of the plants, and sometimes will be named after certain human who discovered them, like a lot of the scientific knowledges. But the difference here is you're less interested in occupying or claiming a form of discovery or knowledge, but more of this relationship between you and these plants. So I think that is really telling to think about your method. This also reminds me that you had mentioned in a conversation with Shanghai-based curator and writer Alvin Lee, where you said now you are less interested in activism, where perhaps was where the initial, when you first started to practice more socially engaged or participatory work, there's a transition from this activism to more spiritual practice and science. I found it's very inspiring or interested to read your perspective, where how you find activism might not be the most effective way of promote social change in an environment that you're situated in, unlike perhaps the North America social context. I wonder if you could comment that a little bit more, but I'm more interested in your interest in the relationship between spiritual practice and science, because oftentimes they seems to be a little bit of it in opposition.
I still try to create social interventions whenever I can, right? So maybe I'll talk about some of the workshops that I've organized, but maybe just I don't have clear answers. I feel like I only live once. And I probably will only know what I have done if I could live twice, to try different things. So I think life is just one-time experience. So, like you said, I think I came back to China after I finished my coursework for PhD in 2010, and I started teaching in Hangzhou. I taught for 3 years there, focusing on social engaged art, on social practice. And of course, in China, I think we are also interested in this idea of art making social change. But for current political situation, but actually for historical reasons too, I quickly realized that we collectively, we are much more accustomed to teaching and learning as a way to affect social change. I think in China, if you look at audience participation, people are very interested in participating. So I think that the notion of participation is there. It's not new. And I think but in terms of rights-based activism is very new and also very difficult to do. But in terms of learning-based social change, I think we are at a moment historically that everyone is interested in learning. And also, traditionally, if you look at Chinese traditional practice, there's the emphasis on teaching and learning is always core to social change. So I think since I came back 12 years ago, I decided to focus on this. I am teaching in university, but I also think many of the art projects I'm doing, I try to learn and I try to share the learning, and I also try to create teaching situations in these projects. And again, there are many different forms of activism. I'm also very interested in Extinction Rebellion, for example. In Germany, I was very happy to see and also to follow what they do. But I think this form of activism is very difficult to, I think right now it's impossible to do in China, perhaps even in Hong Kong. But there are always things we can do. And like I said, life is just one-time experience. So I rather focus on things I can do rather than thinking about things I can't do.
Yeah, maybe this is a good segue to talk about your workshop that you conducted in Berlin at Grosse Piersbau as part of your solo exhibition, and also some of the other projects that you did in Japan.
Right. I'll describe them, but I also want to say how limited these projects are. We can also talk about the limitations.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just describe them first. So
Sure.
I was doing residency in Berlin at the Grosse Piersbau, this public art institution, and I realized that the institution still thinks of the building as the art institution, but actually outside the building there are 100, more than 100 plane trees. So much of my work there focused on how to bring people to the plane trees, to see those trees as beings living on the site of the art institution. And then I thought, how do we really transition into a more ecological future to think of art institutions not as a human only or as an anthropocentric institution? How do we really bring at least the thinking of multi-species, where in Chinese I would say 万物? How do we bring 万物 thinking into the art institution? So it's a very small intervention. I decided to organize a group called the 万物 Council. 万物 means 10,000 things. For people who don't read Chinese, it's this Taoist idea that between heaven and earth, there are myriad beings. So the council will consist of 12 members. Each will channel a different form of being or a different materiality. And so I made these scarves to signal the being that the member will channel. So there's history, forests, fox, because there's a lot of fox around in Berlin, water and knowledge, soil and microbes. Specifically on microbe, because I was talking to microbiologists who studies E. coli. So for people who study biology, they would know the right costume shows E. coli just on a much larger scale. So so I work with the institution to identify and invite 12 members to form the first 万物 Council. The members they are scientists, they're also gardeners and political activists, and also internal staff like the outreach volunteer of the institution, and also young artists in Berlin. So we met for 3 days in the institution, and also we went to a forest, which is right outside Berlin. It's a 12,000-year-old beech forest. So we spent the second day there, discussing and with the other beings around. And then the third day, we wrote and developed 4 versions of manifesto. So these are the 4 versions. And then we combine them into a more succinct textual form. So I'll just read, let's see, up the time. Okay, maybe I'll just read a couple so it's more specific. Okay, I'll read the 18 points. Okay, so the first one is to rename Gropiusbau. So for people who read German, BAU means building, and BAUM means tree. So it's a very tiny but very important intervention to change the name of the institution. Second one, to recognize and mourn death, the death of oneself, of plants and animals, hopes, fears, the sun, the sky, and more. Mourn what has been mourned, mourn the unmournable, because we think that we are so obsessed with life, we completely forget the other half of the life cycle in museums too. Museum is really about how to keep the objects for eternity rather than thinking about cycles. And 3, start composting. It's a very small thing, but the institution has a hard time to do. So it's very concrete to start. And 4, switch to an ethical bank. That's also something possible these days for our institution. And 5, Gropiusbau is already more than human. Communicate the presence of microbes, the Gropiusbau microbiome, by revealing the DNA and RNA sequences of the billions of microbes who already live here. Okay. So many, because we come from many different disciplines, we channel different voices. So you can see the list is quite a diverse list of both long-term visions, but also very concrete things we can do right away. So we developed this, and then now I'm working with 3 young artists in Berlin. Actually, 1 young artist, 1 outreach person, and 1 young curator in the educational department to see how they want to continue the Wanwu Council. But I don't, my role is just to start the thinking and perhaps plant a seed. But it will be to them to see how to grow it, because it's not my project. It's really I think it's much better for people there to continue to develop the project. And so the Gropiusbau, I mentioned, so this is during the exhibition. Actually, I invite the visitors also to propose ideas, and this is the name change was actually proposed by a visitor to the exhibition. I don't know who they are. And I will talk just a little bit about, let's see, okay. So I will just talk a little bit about the Kyoto project. So I was invited to residency in Kyoto. It's a beautiful city. People have been there. It's an old city in Japan, and I've been there as a tourist, but I was very surprised that there's a neighborhood that's completely marginalized. So if you walk out of the Kyoto station, the train station, you just walk east, you cross 1 street, and then the neighborhood became completely quiet, and a lot of houses are abandoned. This is a school that has been abandoned because the population went down. It's a marginalized neighborhood where the people are called Blakumin, meaning roaming people. They were butchers and leather makers who were considered lowest on the Japanese traditional social hierarchy. But the stigma remains today. So when, let's say I'm dating someone who lives in that neighborhood, my parents will still object to the relationship. To me, that's completely shocking. So I got to know this area because the art school in Kyoto has been asked to move into this area to revitalize this neighborhood. And I work with the University Art Gallery to think about how to help future students and young artists to really care about this place, and also to think about its future. To me, when I walk around, it's next to the Kamo River, so there's a lot of birds and animals. So I decided to organize a workshop with young artists in Kyoto, to invite the local activists who has been working there for 40 years. And we did many different things, not just thinking and talking, but also to do some bodily practice there. And again, also visiting a forest and taking a nap. And then we developed manifesto for the future of this neighborhood. So the manifesto calls for equality, not among humans, but among all beings. So it's about equal equality. This manifesto is based on a historical manifesto that started in this neighborhood, calling for equality for all humans in Japan in the 1920s. So everyone in Japan knows that historical episode. It's considered the Bill of Rights in Japan. So the project was to update that historical manifesto to call for equality for all beings, not just for humans. So, but I'll stop talking about these projects. But I also just want to say I also feel very much inadequate in these projects, because we develop the manifestos, but I think I'm not very good at mobilizing tens of thousands of people. So I do think those are important forms, but for many different reasons. I think also personally, personality-wise, I'm more interested in learning and teaching rather than mobilizing 10,000 people. So I do want to acknowledge there's a lot of limitations to this form of social intervention.
Yeah, it's really good to hear you're aware of the limitation. I think it's a very, critical discussion to have, but I also don't fully naively think that one individual would be able to assume all the responsibilities and also make all the necessary changes. It is a much more collaborative project, and would need different kinds of wisdom, let's just put it that way, or social skills, and that is a long-term debate also between these different forms of aesthetic and political practice in our contemporary sort of modes of production. It certainly is not. I think the interest and also the value and the meaning of it is just a continuation of the practice itself. I think is very important. That also lead me to, because a lot of your work, for an audience that are not familiar with some of these old or wisdom or Asian wisdom, we say, coming from the East Asian context, this is also maybe a place to give a little bit of articulation for the title of your project that Rupiah Bao. You just explained what Wan Wu is, a very important Taoist concept. Basically, trying to provide ways of knowing and understanding of how different beings are all connected, and we all exist in a symbiotic environment, which now is, of course, proved to be scientifically true by all these microbiome discoveries and papers in scientific field. But then also when we talk about this action or no action, they evoke another concept of Wu Wei, also is a Taoist concept. Literally, I would say, literally, if you look at the Chinese character, it would be as no action or non-action. But also in one of the articles I read about your work, you had provided a different, perhaps more provocative and more reflective translation as the term, as a quote, I will quote here, a non-cohesive action that is in accordance with the defocus of things. Could you explain a little bit?
It's not my quote. It's
it's not your quote. I forgot who was the, yeah, but
it's Roger Ames. Yes.
Sure. I wonder if you could maybe give a version of your interpretation of that.
Right. So it's Roger Ames who translated, I mean, there are many different translations of Dao De Jing, the Taoist text. The one that I like most is Roger Ames' translation. So I had a conversation with him 2 years ago. He's Canadian actually. He taught in Hawaii for many years and also is affiliated with Beijing University in China. So he and his collaborator translated Wu Wei as non-coercive action. So it's not like not doing anything, but to sense the opportune time. You know, in Chinese we say 天时地利人和, right? So we sense the opportune time, the advantage of the situation, and also the harmony of the people to do something. So I very much think that's what I'm trying to do. So in Kyoto, I was able to organize the workshop to call for equality, because there was a historical declaration of human equality. There's also an activist who has been there for 40 years. There's also the art gallery of the university. They have organized several festivals, but not on the equality theme, but they have been organizing festivals in the neighborhood. And I also, through many different chances, to meet very inspiring young artists. So I think the workshop happened not through my own sheer will or control, but through sensing these different forces and moments. So it seems it felt very organic. It felt right. And so I think, you know, when I look at my practice now, you know, there are many different themes, and those are different projects. And for me, they're all living works. So when the time is right, one project will grow a bit. And so I start to see that I'm cultivating a garden. I'm sensing the time, the season, the forces, also perhaps the will of the project itself. So my role is to cultivate, to care, to water, to let it grow, rather than forcing something to happen. So that's my understanding of Wu Wei in terms of art practice, in terms of my role as an artist.
Yeah, I like that translation a lot, because it also provides a entry point, or maybe an inspiration to reflect on this perceived contradiction that we were talking about earlier, right? Like the how you address the limitation of a kind of practice that aspire to mobilize and aspire to create social change. But I think this might be a way to think through that problem a little bit. My next question, actually, perhaps is a little bit from my own personal reflection. It could be a little bit a high level, a bit abstract, might not necessarily directly linked to your practice, but I'm just very curious. One thing that I have been thinking a lot is the rise of globalism in the 90s, let's say, where what used to be called alternative modernism. Now, I think people corrected that term to be multiple modernism because alternative implies a periphery and center relationship. So there's this rise of the multiple globalism in the 90s, where we see all these major, in terms of in the art context, we see major exhibitions or biennials that trying to showcase artists that are from non-traditional center of the art world. But that kind of discussion is still very much focused on a very, I guess, against the social background and context. I personally see there's an evolvement of this discourse. The globalism somehow now transitioned to a conversation centered around Anthropocene and also planetary conversation, climate change, global ecology. So I feel like there's this metamorphosing of a global scale into a different mode of vocabulary. And I'm curious, like, what's your perspective on that? How do you see what kind of triggered that change and what has, evolved in this process?
Right. I'll just I'll keep one image up. Okay. So I think it's a very important question. Thanks for raising this. I haven't thought about this before. But when I look back, and I also talk to my friends, our generation, I was born in the 1970s. So our generation in China are very much of a globalization generation. I went to the US after high school, and then also was able to travel around and also work in different places. And like many people, I was very interested in different cultures and different societies and social systems, political systems, etc. I think the transition now, like that you have mentioned, and also very much that I'm engaged in, is to go beyond the human. So the term, like you said, is not. It's no longer the globe in terms of the geopolitical sense, but more the planet. And so when, for example, in the picture that I'm showing here, you see people from different cultures, from Russia, from Africa, from South America. Actually, in this picture, you have someone from Africa, from South America, from Europe. I took the picture from Asia. So but it's definitely more than us, right? Because we were in this 12,000 year beech forest. So you have these trees, you have the water there, you have birds, etc. So I think before, if we just focus on the humans, then it's about global. It's about people of different cultures. But then, if you look at the picture itself now, with this awareness of our ecological awareness, then the humans is just a small part of the forest. I think this transition, to me, I was very much interested in modern and contemporary art. But now when I teach, I often say, we have to think about temporality. We have to think about time always through the Earth history perspective. So I will ask students to read Bruno Latour and read Lao Tzu, the Taoist text, because I say, if we look at 4.6 billion years of Earth history, Lao Tzu, which was compiled in 400 BCE or 5th century BCE is very contemporary because it's such a short moment in Earth history. So all these thinkings are still very much in the moment. So I think these ecological awareness really changed the way I sense time and I sense space. Of course, it also changes the way I sense art and history of art. So now I also, without sounding crazy, I also think, Song Dynasty painters are also very much contemporary, right? Again, the same logic. So how, also now we know in China too, we artists and thinkers were already wrestling with ecological disasters and climate change, etc. So I think I really feel that we're in the moment where art history has to be reconceptualized and our institutions have to be reconceptualized. I think that's very much the starting point of this intervention. But of course, like you said, it takes many, many people to collectively make the transition.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very interesting here, particularly how you said the awareness actually changed your sense of time and space. From a more horizontal view of looking at the world, now we have to understand that there is a volume of the planet, and I think that is very inspiring. I think we're at like 6:46. I would like to maybe ask a last question. So before I open it to our audience, and this one is also a little bit, I guess, carries a little bit of a critique from people when talking about this view of go beyond the human species, when we're looking at sort of this coexistence. Perhaps there is a bit of a romantic view, while the climate crisis and also a lot of these neoliberal form of capitalized ecology practices actually really just has this very dangerous potential of ignoring the sort of the injustice and also these sufferings that we are still experiencing on a daily basis, from racial, class, all these struggles historically that we're have not gone very far. So I wanted to kind of just have an understanding from you, how do you negotiate these tensions and contradictions?
Right. I have to say, this hasn't, the issue of eco-justice hasn't been the focus of my practice. I had a conversation with TJ Demos 2-3 weeks ago, who, he very much focused on eco-justice in California. Mm-hmm. If anything, one thing that comes to mind, I'm not, again, it hasn't been my focus that much, but I think this project in Kyoto deals with a little bit in this marginalized neighborhood. So the person here you see, he's an activist in the neighborhood. He has been there for 40 years. Like I said, it's such a marginalized neighborhood that you still have trouble dating someone for young people even. So he started to care about ecological issues. So before he was trying to save the history of the neighborhood, before he was trying to really fight the government, the local government. And now recently he started an organization to clean the river, to think about the birds that come to the river. So I was very happy to meet him and to work with him, because I feel there's a lot of, there's a lot I can learn from him, but there's also a lot of shared concern. So of course, he's very much part of the neighborhood, and he's hugely concerned about justice in the city. But now he's also turning to non-humans, to birds, and to turn, there's a very iconic animal, the giant salamander, that comes swim down the river, is absolutely gorgeous. And then I realized, because for him, he's a true activist. So he's always he's always learning. He's always moving with the energy. So very much now the energy is on ecological awareness and mobilization. So it also becomes a very important. It also becomes a very important force to push for justice by bringing in the ecological concerns, right? So, I think he was also very happy to work with the workshop, because we were able to articulate the fact that this neighborhood, by the fact it's next to the river, they have tradition working with animals and plants, is the most biodiverse area of the city. It's the it also has the most historical experience with working with non-humans. So it completely flips around the narrative of the marginalization. So I think there's a lot. That's why I think there's that. I think you're completely right. It's important to bring in the to bring in the many other dimensions of justice. But I think ecological awareness actually adds to the to existing social movements, rather than diverting it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great point. I'm being a little selfish. I have one more question. If it's the last question, I'm not sure if you want to comment on it or talk a little bit more, but I know you are part of the upcoming Venice Biennale artist. Do you know what you will be showing or what you're working on? Can you give us a little bit sneak peek? Again, like if it's not like something you can say, we can skip this.
The curator told all the artists not to talk about the new works.
Okay.
But it is still, it is a new work, but it is still about cultivating intimacy between humans and plants, but with a slightly different form. I think this is it is an ongoing. I think there's a lot to do, so I think it's going to remain for a long time. I'll be working on this issue for a long time. Yes.
Great. I think we are pretty good. I'm just curious if any of you are tuned in with us, have any additional questions for Zheng Bo. You can type it down in the chat. I haven't seen any questions coming, but actually, yes, there is one from Claire. What led you to start working with plants as collaborators in the first place?
So it's a patch of land in Shanghai. In the summer 2013, I was invited to participate in an exhibition in Shanghai. And I was going to show a video work. I was there to look for a building to show the video work. But then I saw this patch of land full of really vibrant plants. And I was surprised because it's very central in Shanghai. What happened was factory was moved out of the city. And so not many humans were visiting that area, so plants could just grow. And I think I was surprised, and I think the plants caught me to do something. So I changed my plan and told the curator that I want to save the plants so that they will be my artwork. So that's how I started. And I think the plants really opened my eyes to what lived right next to me. And of course, I think I chose to work with plants instead of say octopus, because I think it's much harder to work with octopus every day. I still want to work with octopus one day, but it's hard to do every day. But plants, I have plants wherever I go, so I can work with plants and just spend time with them every day. So I think that's why I chose to work with plants.
Yeah, but I also like just sort of this relationship with plants, because they're so omnipresent. They are just part of our surroundings. It's not something overly exotic that you have to seek out.
Yes.
That I think is also really important.
Yes, I think early on, when I was working on social practice, I was very much influenced by the idea of the everyday. I think that continues. So I work with weeds because weeds are around. I go up the hill. So I think the notion of the everyday is still very central. Yeah.
Great. Do we have any? Oh, I see one more question. As a struggling artist navigating hard times in this pandemic, I'm curious about your views on NFTs, their environmental impact, and how you negotiate what you can live with. I'm not sure if it's relevant to your practice, but would you like to give an attempt to answer?
I don't know much about NFT. I feel like I actually studied computer science when I was an undergraduate in the US. I think I got my dose of technology very early. I saw I was working with a professor on 3D printing in 1997 at Berkeley. So it's very early. So I think I was kind of vaccinated against technology early on. So now I actually don't really have a lot of curiosity of technology. And I think things always happen, yin and yang, two forces always happen at the same time. So now you have people like me who are really committed to spending time with other forms of life. But then you have the other force that's pulling even further away from the planet. So these two forces are happening at the same time. I think precisely because they're dealing with the same crisis in some ways. I think the question already suggested the environmental impact of of technology, right? So all the again, but we are using technology still. We're doing this over Zoom. There is an environmental impact. So I try, for example, I try in my practice not to over document things, because all the file, like if I shoot 2-hour video of something, there is a large environmental cost for sure, and also by keeping those 2-hour footage up somewhere.
Okay, we have one more question. I think I also feel that thought that you mentioned about how we have these two pulling forces. One is looking inwardly on the species in the earth that we're sharing. The other is, let's say, Mars occupation or outer space or rockets or even artificial intelligence, right? Is right. The other sort of form of, I like how this is really kind of a trigger triggered by the crisis that we have at the present, at the moment. That's a really nice framework to think about. So we have another question. I am curious about ways you might track the unique vocabularies of different species or ecologies besides your beautiful drawings and workshops. If there are something like words you've come to share with them.
It's a good question, but I actually don't completely understand the question. I think it seems to be quite philosophical. I would just mention something I have thought about. I think you also talk about this. I don't know whether it will answer the question directly. The term 万物, I have gravitated towards this term because I should think it's a more beautiful or even more accurate term than many terms that exist in English right now, like like multi-species, humans, non-humans, or Gaia, the Lovelock term, earthbound, etc. I like this term 万物 because it's very visual. So when I say this term, 10,000 beings, it's both concrete but also collective. And of course, the 10,000 for us now is not a huge number, but pre-modern time it will be the largest number that we had. So it's also kind of uncountable, but very visual. I think that the problem with Gaia is still a sort of an individual goddess or person, and multi-species. The notion of species is problematic. Human, non-human, it's cumbersome in that sense. So I actually very much like the Taoist term 万物. And I was just teaching an article by Donna Haraway a few days ago. Of course, she also mentions many terms from many different languages and indigenous cultures. Perhaps we are all looking at alternative word, like use some multiple traditions to see what the notions to bring to reactivate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recently just encountered a book about how a social scientist invented all these words to describe new words to describe human emotions, that might be stimulated or enhanced in our contemporary ways of living. So these are all new vocabularies, and that's very interesting. I learned quite a few words. There are very specific feelings, like one word, I actually forgot what the word is, but it describes an airy feeling where you are in a otherwise crowded place, but looking at it empty. So that is a pandemic triggered sort of psychological response. So I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so we have one more question, and then this will be the last question. Interesting presentation. Thank you so much for bringing it to us. Plant appears to be static and rather unresponsive. Just wondering, what's your way of communication and interaction developed during your practice with them? Any interesting experience?
I think plants are very active, but on different time scale. So I often think about my practice as both cultivation and self-cultivation. I'm trying to learn to be slower, so that I can sense their agency. And I also started to learn Chinese traditional practice. I started to learn Qigong, and I started to incorporate it into a project that I call eco-sensibility exercise, because we need to reactivate our ecological sensibilities. So I just want to mention one thing and then stop. So I learned how to stand, how to breathe in the very traditional Qigong way. And I was teaching this in Berlin with the trees outside the museum. And then I just realized the way the Qigong practice stand and breathe is just the way that trees stand and move their energy. So I don't know, you know, I haven't done the research to see whether Qigong was really inspired by plants, but I wouldn't be surprised, you know, because like you said, you know, we don't live individually, we actually live symbiotically. So many of the biological processes or ways of living are shared among all forms of being. So like also you mentioned spirituality, etc. before. So now I feel, you know, I'm interested in both, you know, scientific research, but also in traditional notions like qi. They are not in contradiction. They are, you know, like you said, the more research we do, the more we realize, the more we actually learn, but more from the microscopic level that these notions are very much scientific.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Zheng Bo, and it was a wonderful conversation. I feel like we have so much more to talk about. I would love to continue the exchange in one way or another.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too.
Yeah, thank you to you both for this amazing conversation, presentation, dialogue. It's been amazing to bear witness to. Thank you for everyone also for attending. For more information about the continuation of our Lost and Found Agency series, visit Instagram, our website, and check your inboxes because there'll surely be something out sooner rather than later. But thank you both again.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I look forward to visiting you soon.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Good morning.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.